jungle.
Hello, you are listening to Trump Republic Radio. It is April 11th, 2018. I'm your host, Enzo Quesada, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Bobby Hester.
Hello, everyone.
And, Bobby, today we are doing a midweek for the first time in what seems like forever at this point.
It's the last time we did one was January, Enzo.
In January.
It's been, February, March, April, 3 months.
Yeah,
since we've done
apologize on that. You know, we used to be so good with the midweeks, but things have just been busy. But we've been, prosing different ideas to do. We want to come back strong with the midweek. And this week, I think we got an interesting topic that we have quite a lot of information on. And that is secessionist movements. Why, Bobby, did you want to do secessionist movements?
I wanted to do it for just a couple of reasons. If you remember last Sunday on the show, we talked about a story about the South Carolina GOP, and they introduced a bill to secede if there was ever going to be gun confiscation. Because of, wanting disagreements with the federal government, that sort of thing. And so you and I had previously had a conversation that we just talked when we were hanging out one day about just secession in general and how different things play into different groups wanting to be independent. And so we got the idea, it's like, hey, why don't we just do a midweek on secession?
Yeah, and we kind of got this multifaceted covered with this episode today. So you have the history of secessionist movements in the United States.
Yes.
While I covered present-day international secessionist movements. So, kind of the best of both of our minds. You have a very extensive history, knowledge of American history, and I am very knowledgeable of geography internationally. So, I don't know. Do you want to get into it, or were there some other things you wanted to talk about?
Well, I think that before we get into any of these, one thing I did want to ask is just get both of our thoughts generally on what we think about just the idea of secession overall. Things we like about it, things we don't like about it, do we agree with it, don't agree with it, that sort of thing. So, who do you think should start? Do you want to start or I'll start?
I guess I'll start with a statement just off the top of my head about my feelings on this. I agree with secessionist movements for the most part. I think rule is better when it's done locally, it's done along people of similar, background, to where a group of people is more authentically represented. It's kind of what we fought the First World War supposedly over, self-determination of people. And, we have avoided major conflict in the world by just setting groups aside. Europe used to be, hundreds of different states, all fighting each other, rivalries here and there. For hundreds of years, Europe languished because they weren't unified in any sense. But when we set aside the groups that had issues in Europe into separate states like we have today, Europe is an extremely peaceful place today because borders are kind of like the boundaries of a home. And if we want to have a peaceful community, we want, a secure neighborhood for everyone. Kind of, symbolic, I guess, on it. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on it, though?
My general thoughts is I agree with you. I, in general, do support the idea of secession. But one of the points that I wanted to hit on why I tend to agree with it, on top of the things that you said about, people with similar backgrounds and whatnot, is just imagine cities and a country and just land in general, but without geopolitical borders. Imagine just as these giant land masses. The left is right sometimes when they talk about how, borders are arbitrary.
Yes.
And so if you look at, for instance, like go onto Google Earth or something and just look at a satellite view, not like a road map, but just like a satellite view, you see it's just giant land masses. And if you don't have anything turned on, like city labels, all you see is just stuff. If you put up just city labels or just, country boundaries and you look at things the way they are, there really isn't very much of a difference between Kansas and Nebraska.
Yeah.
Because it's all part of, like the Great Plains. And then you have the Rocky Mountains. You got the Pacific Northwest. You got like the desert. That's what you see. You see differences in terrain and differences in weather, climate, which leads to differences in culture of people that live there. For instance, if you look up at the Pacific Northwest, it's very, it's pretty cold there. It rains a lot. It's very green in terms of there being forests all over the place. And the people there, arguably, what does an average person that lives in Seattle have in common with someone who lives in Miami? There's not much of a difference. Yet you're all part of the same country, all having different interests. Even if, politically you agree with each other, there's really not much people have in common.
Yeah.
And so, there are people thousands of miles away who think a different thing than you do, who act different ways than you do, who have different priorities than you do, are ruling over you. And so for instance, if you're someone who lives in like Wyoming or something, there's only like 500,000 people that live in that entire area. Whereas Los Angeles County has like 3 million people that live there? 5 million people that live there?
Something like that.
Your average rural farmer, for instance, in Kansas has probably absolutely nothing in common with someone who lives in Los Angeles, other than you speak the same language. But you have different priorities, you make money in different ways, you're probably religiously different, you're culturally different people. So when you look at it with secession movements, you can understand why these groups would want to just be by themselves, make their own decisions, and not have people from other areas with other cultures or spoken languages be different than them.
Yeah. I was just recalling where kind of this conversation originally came from, and it was from, me going to Kansas City.
Right.
Because Kansas City is in Missouri and also Kansas. But for the people that live there, it's very arbitrary. You go back and forth between the states all the time.
It's just a city,
Yeah, it essentially is just one city.
If you were flying in from an airplane, you'd see one massive city.
So, there is an arbitrary border between this city that delineates between the peoples that live there, but they don't really see it that way whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the same for everywhere in the world. Our relations to borders is shaped on our history around these borders and how this has changed over the course of history, which is why it's so interesting for me, because it's so dynamic to every single place, which is, why I wanted to get into what is outside of the United States even. But before we get into what's in outside of the United States, you want to go into what you got.
Yeah, so first off, I think the best thing that we can talk about as just a general example of the history of a secessionist movement in the United States was obviously the Confederate States of America during the 1860s. And I don't think we need to go into too much detail as to why, per se, the states decided to secede. I think everyone should know, but everyone likes to talk about slavery, but there is also the thing about states' rights. But what I really want to talk about is just look at just the different cultures of the South versus the North in the period of the Civil War. The South was largely agricultural, and the North, a lot of their economy relied on things that are urban and factories and whatnot, things like that. This North was a lot more technologically developed. When they were getting telegraph lines put up, a lot of places in the South didn't get those. And same thing with trains. The South a lot of times didn't have that much trains, or they'd have like one track, whereas the North would have them all over the place. So you can see how you start developing these two different economies, these two different cultures per se. There was some agriculture in the North and there was some urbanization in the South, but for the most part it was completely different things. And
the North received more immigration as well.
And so you had these two essentially very different people that, while they have a shared history of fighting in the Revolutionary War, War for Independence, how I like to call it, granted they have the shared history, they live different lives. And so when the South was starting to lose power, especially in the Electoral College, the entire South voted, to elect a candidate, and the North voted essentially to elect Lincoln. The North at that point had won the presidency, and the South realized they could not elect someone to
The White House.
to the White House ever again. And so you can understand why they would say, okay, fine, if we're not going to be able to have power here, we're out, we're leaving.
Which is similar, in today's sense, what they're all talking about with the Colexit, But at least in their circumstance, they have a chance of voting themselves out, so with changing demographics in the nation.
Exactly. And so, and if you look at just the history of the way borders have changed, I mean, you look at just Texas history even, Texas wanted to get the land from, I forget what the first river was, but essentially they wanted to expand southward to the Rio Grande, where the current southern border of Texas is today. Those areas were originally, they very well easily could have been part of Mexico. And yet, culturally speaking, that area down there in the Rio Grande Valley is a lot more like Mexico than people who live in like Dallas or Fort Worth or even Austin are. Yeah. So you can understand that it's like, okay, you have very different types of people ruling over one another when they a lot of times don't look the same, they speak a different language, they have a different ethnicity, they just religiously a lot of times are different. They're just culturally different, and yet they have say over one another.
Yeah.
And so, it through changing things like this, I just wanted to use that as an example, but that, Confederate States is the most popular example as to the history of a secessionist movement in the United States. But I wanted to also move on to modern day movements that are in the United States, because the ones you got for international, those are all modern day movements.
Yes.
Yeah. And so what we want to talk about is current modern day ones, and just give you an idea of which ones exist. So the first one I wanted to talk about was the Confederate States of America, and this is the modern day version. There are a lot of people that still live in the South that want the South to be its own country. You can still have the same states, but just rule over itself. Modern Confederacy movements, a lot of people like to call them neo-Confederates, even though I don't really like that term. But these movements don't necessarily support bringing back slavery. In fact, most of them do not. There are some that do, but most of them do not believe in that. They just want the South, as we said, even today, is a lot culturally different than a lot of the rest of the country. But they want to be independent. So
yeah.
Now, and also those groups, a lot of those people also live in the North, and yet they have like Southern heritage stuff. So it's not like it's a very strong movement. It's very spread out, and it's also pretty weak. But the next movement that I wanted to talk to is the Lakota Nation. Now, the Lakota Nation is a group of Native Americans or Indians, if you want to call them that, and if you think about their history as the nation was expanding, and the U.S. had westward expansion, manifest destiny, whatever you want to call it, we started pushing, the Native Americans off their land into different reservations and stuff. Sometimes they had treaties, sometimes they fought wars. A lot of it was bloody, a lot of it was peaceful too. I agree with a lot of people who say that we've mistreated Native Americans a lot. I do agree with that. But that being said, if you look at where they live today, you'll see they mostly live in places like Oklahoma, and also out west in the desert in like New Mexico, Arizona, and just all over the place. But there's a lot that are also in the Great Plains region, where their people were originally from. The Lakota Nation is, in that area right now. And so that includes parts of North and South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Nebraska. And there's a pretty small movement, but it does exist, of groups within the Lakota Nation that want to secede from the United States. And you understand, secede. One country will no longer have say over the other country. They will only have say over, what's in their territory. But they also have to get along or do what they can do, because they're going to be living right there. And also, if you think modern day secession, you've got a lot of infrastructure that connects. You've got roads, you've got bridges, you've got power lines. Imagine if California seceded, what would happen with the Hoover Dam? It supplies a lot of electricity. Would they suddenly have to start paying for that differently? Would they just continue to use it and just...
And California imports water as well.
Yeah. And, I know we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here, but just you can understand how difficult the question of secession becomes logistically speaking. It's not just to say, fine, we want to go our separate ways. You're still right there. And that's one of the problems with the Lakota people is none of their existing tribal governments actually support the movement because of benefits that they do receive from the federal government. They know that they would not have the ability to control that. Plus, there are a lot of major cities that lie within those boundaries. And the boundaries, if you're wondering, you can look up. It's the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which both the Native Americans and the United States, both of them violated that treaty, to no end. So these groups want to go back to that treaty, back to those boundaries. The problem is you do have a lot of major cities that live there, and there are people that live in those cities that would not want to secede from the United States. And that's where their biggest problem comes with the Lakota people. But moving on, we go down to South Carolina. And this is kind of what I mentioned in the intro. In April 2018, the South Carolina GOP introduced a bill in their state legislature to secede from the United States if the United States began gun control. So this is a movement that it's not going to gain any steam because it has to go into their Senate before their session ends, and it's not going to have the time to do that. But that's just an example of there are people today that are willing to go and say, hey, we'll secede if you do things we don't like. Next up is Hawaii. Now, if you understand the history of Hawaii, it was, for the longest time, not a U.S. state or a U.S. territory. It was its own people. Hawaiian people are their own people. They had their own king. I think everyone understands that. And there are a lot of people that are native Hawaiians that don't want Hawaii to be part of the United States. They want to go back to being their own country, their own independent nation. If you want to, get along with the U.S. and allow people to move here, that's your own thing to deal with, and you have to figure that out for themselves. But, for the most part, that's pretty much what they want. They want to be independent. I would actually support that movement, personally. I have no problem with areas of the country secede, and I feel like if any place in the U.S. was to want to secede, Hawaii would probably be the easiest because it's its own island. It is geographically separate from the rest of the country. Yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to say about that. Now, moving on to some bigger movements. First off is the Republic of Texas. Now, and so you and I have met a lot of Texas secessionist people, haven't we?
Yeah, a fair number of people.
And so we understand how, when everyone thinks of Texas, both in Texas and outside the U.S., the state has its own type of culture. And I think everyone understands what I mean by that.
When you're in Texas, you feel like you're in a different country.
You do.
When I originally moved to Texas, roughly a decade ago at this point, when I arrived in Texas, it seemed like I was in a different country.
Yeah.
I could not believe I was still in the United States. It's so different than the rest of the country. And as a Texan, you have a sense of the world only in terms of what it is to Texas, pretty much. To a strange degree, but it's because we have so much in one state. It's a very large state.
Yeah, but you do understand how, the state has its own culture. Texans think of themselves one way. The rest of the country thinks of Texas one way. And you can understand how your average Texan probably doesn't have that much in common with your average person from, say, Cascadia. And so you can understand how these are different areas, different groups. Culturally, they're different, and yet they're part of the same country. They have say over one another. They have the power to elect people that will make changes in their lives and the way that they live, which could positively or negatively affect them. You can understand why people would say, you know what? Let's just be on our own. Let's just take the borders of Texas and let's secede. And Texas has its own power grid. So
The
in
only
that
state
regard,
to have its
yeah,
own.
the only state. So, in that regard, Texas probably would be the most successful state to secede and become its own country. I know, we're going to get to California next. And granted, California's economy is larger than the economy of Texas. California would have to rely on the United States for a lot of that stuff, especially with their changing demographics. And, we talk about income inequality being a problem. It's very bad out in California, and I don't think California would actually be able to sustain itself the way things are currently going without, U.S. tax dollars helping them out.
Most definitely.
Whereas Texas would. Texas has a great economy. Texas operates a lot differently than the rest of the country.
Yeah. And, in terms of just Texas secession, I remember there was a poll, prior to the 2016 election, just heading in, that a majority of Texans would agree with secession if Hillary Clinton had won the presidency. Which is crazy to consider, but, that's just how independent we see ourselves from other states. And, if any place could become a country in the United States, I think it would be Texas.
Yeah. And also, there was a poll that came out, I believe this came out in January of this year, or it might have been slightly earlier than that, or it might have been January 2017, either way. But there was a poll, I forget who did it, and it found 68% of Americans support the idea of a state seceding. And it didn't specify what state. Could be their own state, could be, if, say, Hawaii wanted to be its own country, would I, as a Texan, support that? That kind of idea is what that poll was getting. And so 68%, that's over 2/3, would support it. The idea of a state seceding.
I mean, I most definitely did myself, so.
And that's up from, I think the same poll had it in like the mid to like high 20s, low 30s, back even just like 5 or 6 years ago. And it shifted that much.
It's because of political polarization to a good degree.
And so I can understand, especially in today's day and age, the way that the United States is so politically divided. I can understand why different states would want to just be their own country.
Do you remember, it must have been months ago at this point, on the Sunday show, when we had the Rasmussen report numbers on the shift in political polarization?
Yes, I do.
Where just in 1995, most people were centrists. Most people were moderates. The fringes didn't have many people whatsoever. And now we live in a completely inverse society, and only in the course of, 2 decades pretty much. And, it's why you are getting this attitude change on secessionist movements here for states in the United States. But, not to detract from where you're going, but, you can feel it in the air.
Yeah.
And there's numbers to back that up, actually.
And, kind of moving on away from Texas here into California, I'd say if any state's current secessionist movement was the strongest, it would be California. And even then, it's, not that strong. It's pretty weak. But a lot of people do secretly agree with it, especially after Trump won. I mean, that's the reason why California is even, or I should say groups in California are thinking about seceding. I mean, the California Secretary of State and the California Attorney General back last year allowed groups to collect signatures. And if they got enough signatures, it would for sure be on the 2018 ballot. Now, I don't know if they're still continuing to do that. I've heard that, a couple of groups have just stopped collecting signatures. So it seems like that idea mostly is dead. But, if you think about California voted like 66 or 62% for Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
Okay, Trump didn't even get a third of the vote. He only got 32%. And so, you can understand how California is so much different than, say the Great Plains states or Texas or the South or even the Midwest, which, flipped red in the last election. Those people don't have anything in common with one another. They think very differently. Even if you are a Democrat in those different states, you don't have anything in common with the other people. I mean, if you look at just, like we said, demographics of a state like Ohio versus a state like California, it's completely different. And yet, they're all part of the same country and they have say over one another. And especially, and I feel like this is one of the problems with the Electoral College, as much as I like it, is the fact that, you just need one state to have just a ton and a ton and a ton of people that all think one way, whereas you have a lot of other states that are more spread out that think a different way. And yet politically, those states that think the other way might lose to a state like California. That's the reason why we created the Senate in, when I think it was
when
Virginia.
we have a House and a Senate.
When you have like Virginia and Rhode Island, I believe, that were fighting over that. Because, different states, different sizes. I don't want that state that's highly populated that thinks one way to rule over me, a smaller state that thinks a different way. And so they created the Senate to balance out power.
Yeah, which is why, Wyoming needs 2 senators, because we won't forget about it as a state then. Because, if it was only 500,000 people only represented by a representative, they'd just have one.
And think about this way. If you look at a map of the U.S. broken down by congressional district, imagine remove state borders, okay? All you have is just a massive country with a lot of people. And you got what, like 435, I think, is the number of members in the House of Representatives. Imagine if you had to then, disperse those 435 without worrying about state borders. Imagine how much different things would be at that point. In a way, imagine how, it could be flipped a lot more red, or it could be flipped a lot more blue if you just divided it out.
Yeah.
You'd have roughly the same amount of people per district. You'd have the same amount of people per district. But if Wyoming all of a sudden is going to be split up to favor different other congressional districts, that would change things a lot. And a lot of smaller areas
dramatically
would
for
lose
a place
power.
like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Imagine if you had to do it that way. So in that regard, it does help these smaller states from actually being remembered. We don't forget about them. That's the purpose of the Electoral College also, is to make sure that these people, these smaller people, still have some say in what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so, in that regard. But California is realizing, wait a minute, it might reach the point to where we might not be able to elect a president that's a Democrat, depending on, where the balance of power changes. That's why you're seeing so much pushback in terms of the 2020 census and all this talk. Because if you don't count illegals as part of the census, and you have to redistrict in the 2020 when you redistrict, they're going to lose power. And that state, as left as it is, does not want to lose power. Especially knowing that that's going to shift power towards places like, the Midwest or the Plain States.
Which, kind of brings in the broader question that we've been kind of poking around on with secessionist movements, and just like, when you live in the United States where part of our power is based on representation, it turns immigration and migration into a political game to play against people. And you can stack the odds, We talk about California as a secessionist movement. Being a sanctuary state is, in a sense, a secession.
Yes.
And California's not even the only state to do that now. Also, Illinois is a sanctuary state. We are having already multiple states fracture from the federal government on immigration law. It's kind of insane.
Yeah, and if a state all of a sudden decides to say we're going to not enforce this federal law that we're supposed to enforce, or we're going to do things our own way, at that point you are a different country. You might be the same state in the United States, but you're acting like a different country. You enforce your own laws at that point. Why should you be part of the same country? Why should you have say over what we do, and why should we have say over what you do? If you want to be your own thing, then, let's let each other be our own thing.
Yeah.
That's just my thought on it.
Which, kind of going back to, where we were in California, there is people within California wanting to separate.
Yeah. And we've
on those reasonings.
Right. And, we've talked about this before in the show, at least I have. And that's really is the state of Jefferson. Now, if you don't know what the state of Jefferson is, it is a movement of people largely in Northern California, and sometimes including like southwestern Oregon in some parts, but mostly Northern California, which if you look at a county map of who won in the last election, you'll see Northern California is all red, except for a couple of places on the coast. It's very red. Whereas the rest of the state, as we said, Hillary Clinton got 62% of the vote. It's very blue. So that area politically is a lot different than the rest of California. If you go out into like the countryside or the like farmland area up there in Northern California and rural California, it's very similar to being in like the countryside of Texas. It's very, very different than the rest of the state. And so there's been a movement for a long time to try to get that part to secede and become its own state in the United States. Not secede and become its own nation, but just, secede from California, become its own state. they've gained a lot of steam recently, especially after this last election. But you don't really hear much about them. But you'll see if you drive around there, there are quite a few people that fly State of Jefferson flags or have like paintings of them and stuff.
Yeah.
You know, they do have this sense of we should be our own state. We should not be part of California, which, you know, I would fully support that myself.
Moving on then, do you want to talk about Cascadia?
Yeah, I kind of brought up Cascadia earlier. Cascadia being, you know, Oregon and Washington.
Cascadia is the one that kind of is more than just the United States.
Yeah, this Cascadia includes like Oregon, Washington, sometimes into Idaho, sometimes not, depending on, you know, different maps they have. But it also includes a lot of British Columbia up in Canada. So, yeah, it's not just the United States that we're talking about here. Because, you know, like I said, just look at a satellite map of the United States. Label Cascadia. You can almost draw a line around the, you know, very green and very mountainous areas there, part of the rest of North America even. I mean, just imagine if you go directly into Canada, north from Texas, into like Saskatchewan and that area. It looks very similar to areas you'd see in Kansas. And yet that's Canada and this is the United States. You go over to Cascadia. You know, you look at Vancouver, the terrain that's around there, the type of people, the way they live, the weather and the climate of that, even down to like Portland. Just, you know, the way people live and act and stuff like there. It's a lot different than the rest of their countries. And so there is a lot of people that want Cascadia to be its own, you know, it's already a region. I mean, if you say the word Cascadia, most people know exactly where you're talking about. Just be its own independent nation. There's already a flag out there that is thrown around a lot, and I like that. I've seen a lot of YouTubers that live in that area have those flags in the background of their videos, so it's very, very funny. But, you know, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of United States independence movements is one that is kind of more hilarious and funny. And this is the last one that I'm going to talk about before I throw it over to you. And that is the Conch Republic. If you don't know what the Conch Republic is, it's in essentially Key West, Florida, that island down there. And this started back in 1982. The U.S. government set up a roadblock on the bridge. You know, there's that very long bridge that connects Key West to the rest of Florida.
Yeah.
They set up a roadblock on that bridge to search cars for narcotics and illegal aliens. So, you know, sounds like a pretty good thing, right? Well, Key West said that it was hurting their tourism economy, and that area relies almost, you know, completely on tourism economy. And so they decided to, quote-unquote, declare independence. And they, quote-unquote, went to war against the United States for 1 minute, that's right, 60 seconds, before surrendering to U.S. troops and asking for foreign aid. So this secessionist movement, if you will, in terms of the Conch Republic, it's all a joke. It's all just them messing with each other. But the United States has gone along with it. And they're just like, you know what, this is kind of funny. They're using it to boost their own tourism, pretty much. But in 1995, the U.S. Army Reserves were conducting a training exercise where they would simulate a land invasion, and they decided to use the island of Key West as the location to do that. However, they failed to inform the city government, so the city government decided to fight back by getting people out there to use water cannons and throw pieces of bread at the troops. Well, the DoD issued a formal apology the next day, saying that they, quote, in no way meant to challenge or impugn the sovereignty of the Conch Republic. The island now uses the Conch Republic as a tourism booster where people can become citizens by blowing on a conch shell and can also buy souvenir passports. They also hold an annual reenactment of the 1995 invasion. So I just wanted to use that last excuse there as, you know, hey, if you want to be a secessionist movement, you might as well go along with it and make it a fun thing for the entire family. And with that, that's all the ones I wanted to talk about the United States. There are quite a few more, but those are just the big ones that I wanted to hit on. So, off to you, Enzo.
Okay, so for this next portion of this discussion on secession movements, what I'm going to state are kind of a combination of secession movements and also separatist, unrecognized states. Because, I mean, there are a good number of those in the world as well. Mm-hmm. Countries that don't actually exist, you know, in the full sense of a country. But to begin the list, I'm going to start off in Europe. and I'm going to start with a country that is less than a country, and that is Nagorno-Karabakh. This is something that we talked about when we did the 2017 Global Conflicts Report, where we talked about what conflicts are happening, currently in the world. And Nagorno-Karabakh is a conflict that's been going on ever since the independence of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Nagorno-Karabakh is situated in between both of those nations. Because, you got to remember, in the scope of things, this used to be the Soviet Union.
Right.
In 1991, this is all the same country. So when the Soviet Union fell, all these different countries were declaring independence, and the boundaries between the Azerbaijani people and the Armenian people was very arbitrary until that point. But it quickly fell to ethnic conflict between the two sides, and Nagorno-Karabakh is technically it's part of Azerbaijan, but it is held by Armenian people. It's they cooperate, alongside, they fight with the Armenian people. There are border clashes, every single month, I'd say, that just goes on here. It's been sporadic since the 90s. But yeah, that's the first nation I want to get into. Kind of a very esoteric little place. Nagorno-Karabakh is very small, but people live there apparently.
And they have enough to the point where they want to actually fight over it too.
But this next case that I want to go into is kind of more in the sense of cultural unity, a nation of people, in the true sense of the word nation, as a grouping of people. And that is the Basque Country. Most people, when they think of France, they think French people are a unified people, but it isn't really the case whatsoever. It's just been unified for so long. But the Basque people are a non-French speaking people. I mean, most people still speak French, obviously, but their first language is Basque, and linguistically, its closest relation is with Hungarian. If you understand Latin languages and Romantic languages, Spanish and French and Italian, they're all linguistically the same family, which is connected to how these peoples moved about and whatnot. But the Basque people are severely different in terms of, French people. And also the Basque Country straddles into Spain, into Navarra. They're a Western Pyrenees people. And, I mean, culturally, they have more in common with each other across these countries than they do with their host nations. But, they've just been dealt these cards for hundreds of years. To go into the next nation, or secessionist movement I wanted to talk about, it is another French minority group, and that is the Bretons in Brittany. Now, Brittany is, if you look on a map of France, in northwest France, there's kind of a peninsula off of France, close towards the United Kingdom. And the thing about Brittany is those people are ethnically not related to French people, as we see it, French cosmopolitans to Paris and whatnot.
Right.
These people are Celtic, so they're related to Irish people. The Breton language is also not related to French whatsoever. It's a severely different language. There's still people there that only know Breton. Recent polling I've seen for attitudes in Brittany are 1 in 5 people want to succeed. So it's not extremely strong, but there's always been that sentiment. And I mean, in the past, they used to be their own nation, their own kingdom. So that attitude has just always been there. Moving on, I wanted to talk about the situation of Flanders. Flanders, or the Flemish people, are the Dutch-speaking minority of Belgium. In Belgium, the predominantly spoken language is French. So, it's interesting. These regions have been controlled by different nations over the course of history. Belgium used to be part of the Netherlands. It's also been part of France at times in its history. So you get these people that have been kind of spilled out during the regions over the course of history, but these are culturally and linguistically and ethnically different peoples living in the same nation. And, the Flemish and the Walloons in Belgium, they don't have a strong hatred of each other. They've lived to get next door to each other for hundreds of years, thousands of years, but these separations still exist. Moving on to two separatist nations within Georgia. Georgia, if you don't know, is in the Caucasus region of Europe. Also next to Russia. The first one is Abkhazia, which is, if you look on a map of Georgia, it is the most western tip of Georgia. Abkhazia is ethnically different than most Georgians. The people in Abkhazia, the Abkhaz, are Iranian people, but they're still predominantly Christian out there. But I don't know, it's a very small region, but it's had its independence. I mean, it's an unrecognized nation, but it's had it for, I want to say, at least the last decade for some reason.
So it actually is independent.
It's not a recognized nation, but
does the Georgian government treat it like it's independent?
Georgia doesn't have control over it.
Ah.
It's a different government.
Yeah.
It's just not a recognized one. People live there, though.
Yeah,
It's
I was going to
strange.
say, I looked that one up. It's got a population of about 240,000. So we're not.
Yeah.
A lot of these places we're talking about
That's
are
not a lot of people.
We're not talking about like major things. A lot of these are small and some are big too.
Yeah. And the other breakaway nation in Georgia I wanted to mention is South Ossetia. Spelling-wise, it kind of looks like South Ossetia, but that's actually an incorrect pronunciation. But this has actually been the host of a lot of fighting ever since Georgia, gained its independence. Actually, thinking back, when Georgia gained its independence, because it was part of the Soviet Union, Abkhazia declared its own independence immediately.
Yeah.
And that's what South Ossetia did as well, or South Ossetia. Ossetians are actually an ethnic group onto their own. I believe that they are most ethnically related to like Circassians, also in the Caucasus Mountains. But yeah, this has been the site of a lot of fighting. When Georgia gained its independence, there was fighting between South Ossetia and Georgia, and also in 2004, and also in the Russian-Georgian War in 2008, where you ended up having Russian troops move into South Ossetia and then move into Georgia proper. I remember at the time when that was happening, I was actually an Alex Jones fan. I thought it was the end of the world. Little did I know. It wasn't, but I did know the region very well from that time.
Yeah.
Going on now to another unrecognized nation, but a lot of nations have recognized their independence, and that's Kosovo. So Kosovo is technically part of Serbia. I mean, you have to go back to the Yugoslav Civil War, back starting in 1992, after the death of Tito and the breakup of Yugoslavia. Kosovo really got its prevalence in the world stage in 1999 when Clinton sent airstrikes there to, protect the Albanian minority that makes up the majority now of Kosovo. Over a short period of time, Albanians have become, the majority population in Kosovo, which, if you don't know about Albanians, that's actually a Muslim people, very different than, Orthodox Serbs. But once we came in and we stopped Milosevic and defended Kosovo. They've been able to gain. They declared independence at least in 2008, and I believe over 100 nations have recognized Kosovo as a nation. They have their own independent government. In terms of, breakaway states, it's well off, which is not saying a lot.
No, it isn't.
Going to one that is very mysterious, actually. Transnistria in Moldova. Technically Moldova. It is on the border between Ukraine and Moldova. It's this very thin strip breakaway nation. When Moldova gained its independence after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, people in Transnistria, where it's multicultural, but like the biggest group is Russian, saw themselves more closely related to Russia than Moldova.
Right.
Moldovans are ethnically the same as Romanians, just to give you a sense on that. So when Moldova gained its independence, Transnistria just declared war on Moldova immediately, and they had a ceasefire. And now Transnistria is this hotbed of international weapons trading and hacking, and it's this very shady place. It's difficult to get into, but yeah, a lot of crime happens there. I don't know.
I bet.
A Transnistrian passport isn't recognized by most nations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at their flag that they have. It's got a communist symbol on it, so I wouldn't want to recognize that personally.
Yeah. The next thing I wanted to get into is back to kind of the Caucasus Mountains. There are, separate secessionist movements in Russia in the Caucasus Mountains that are presently going on. The most prevalent one, which is something that we've talked about in the Global Conflicts Report in 2017, was the situation in Chechnya, which, isn't extremely hot at the moment, other than the government's there saying that gay people don't exist because they're little concentration camps. But the Chechens are a group of people ethnically related to Tatar people. They're not the same, ethnicity as Russian people, but they speak Russian. They are a Muslim minority within Russia. In Russia, they break it up to where, they call them separate nations, where different ethnicities that are minorities are the majority in these states, and they're autonomous to their own. Mm-hmm. They have a ton of independence comparatively to, most nations. But, Chechnya has tried to declare their independence on several occasions. They've had two notable wars in the 90s, and there's still a lot of fighting today. You also have another nation I wanted to mention, which is just kind of interesting, and that is Karakai-Balakaria. These people, the Karachi and the Balakarians, they are Tartar people as well, so they're Mongolian, but they are Buddhist. But this is technically in Europe. So it is the only place in Europe where Buddhist people live, by virtue of being in Russia and the Caucasus Mountains. So just kind of, you wouldn't think of Buddhism being that far out.
No, you think of Buddhism in Asia.
It does exist, and it has to do with, the Mongolian Empire pushing people westward. Moving on now to something that we've talked about in the news a lot in Trump Public Radio in the course of the past year, and that's Catalonia.
Yeah, in Spain.
In Spain. We already mentioned the Basque Country as another separatist movement in Spain. Catalonia, this past year has voted on independence, but it wasn't recognized by the authorities in Madrid. There's been a giant crackdown on them doing so, but, Catalonia... The Catalan people, it's a different language. Catalan is a different language than Spanish. They have a long history of being in separate nations. You can go back to the Spanish Civil War, when it was Catalonia as the base of the, Republic in Spain. the anarchist Spain. That's where, the roots are. And those roots are still there even today, politically. It's the most left-wing part of Spain. But, they're pretty... This is... If there is any secessionist movement in Europe that could possibly happen at this point, it's probably going to be Catalonia, which is interesting to say. I don't know. What are your thoughts on Catalonia, Bobby?
If I'm a person who lives in Spain, it might trouble me to have part of the territory leave. However, if they're politically different than them, then they should, I think probably be on their own. That way, no one can mess with them. Problem is if they start messing with other people, because then, if Catalonia leaves, do they suddenly want to join the EU? And if they do, then are they going to suddenly start, electing people to the EU that are a lot more left-leaning when otherwise those people might be right-leaning or, whatever their equivalent of those things are. So it could shift the balance of power in the European Union, which is probably not a good thing since they are so leftist. But it would probably be better off for the people on the ground there.
Yeah. Moving on now to 3 kind of separate secessionist movements, all out of Ukraine, as of the Ukrainian civil war that has broken out in the past couple of years. You have the Donetsk Republic and the Lugansk Republic. These are 2 separatist states, unrecognized in eastern Ukraine, that are pro-Russian. So the situation kind of in Ukraine, ethnically wise, the Donetsk and Lugansk Republic are majority Russian people. The same with the third nation that we're actually talking about, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, which, is now annexed by Russia itself proper. When they had the referendum in Crimea, to join Russia, it was over 90% of the people supported that.
Well, yeah,
These people, and, just in relative history, the Soviet Union dissolution was only in 1992. These are Russian people.
Mm-hmm.
They've always saw themselves as part of Russia, not part of Ukraine.
Yeah,
Ukraine is a modern inception of a nation.
Yeah, I was going to say, the Republic of Crimea, that island there is about 60% Russian, only about 25% Ukrainian.
Yeah.
So, it should be Russia, if you understand what I mean by that.
Yeah. Which, I don't know. The situation in Ukraine is very bad. I've read many books on what's going on over there. And, the corruption is so bad when you live in those eastern territories, which are very rural, which, their government services might have been sold up the road to some guy trying to make a quick buck. There's more security for a lot of those people in the past, in the Soviet Union. They feel like there's more chances that Russian services will reach them, in terms of, say, petrol or gas than, Kievian. So I don't know. It's a very complicated story. Ukraine is a very multicultural nation. It's very, very difficult past. But yeah, there's 3 separate secessionist movements there currently.
Yeah.
And then finally for Europe, we're going to go into a nation which has had a vote recently to secede, but voted against doing so, and that is Scotland. Scotland, has a very long history of rebellion against England. They always wanted their independence. They're, culturally very different. And, ever since the Brexit has happened, the sentiments for, secession are even stronger because Scotland is one of the most left-wing and socialist parts of the United Kingdom there is.
Yeah, Scotland voted to remain part of the EU.
If you had just counted, vote to remain or to leave, all of Scotland was remain. So.
And that actually contributed to a lot of the percentage vote of remain for the rest of the United Kingdom too.
Yeah.
Like if you take that region out, it was like leave was like, a lot higher.
Because
it wasn't just
I
like
believe
52%.
Wales also wanted to leave.
Yeah. It goes up to, much greater than whatever, like 52% that it was.
Yeah.
Close to 60, I think, if the numbers are correct. I'll look that up, though.
So, moving on from there, there's only three things that we have to touch on in North America. You know, not too much to talk about, but the first one is Quebec. So, Quebec is the French-Canadian province of Canada. If you look at the history of colonization in North America, the first people to move into Canada were the French, and they moved inwards. And the British, followed suit and wanted their territory and eventually did take it. But, the Quebecers have always seen themselves as separate from Canada itself. Culture is extremely different. They speak a different language. They're very hostile to outsiders, and the push for independence has been very strong. And, if Quebec was its own nation, in terms of GDP, it would be just, after Mexico and Canada and the United States, the fourth strongest economy in North America.
Amazing.
Not that Central America has much to put up, but there is waterways all along the Great Lakes out to Quebec. It would be viable, even though they aren't not a coastal
They're
territory.
landlocked.
Yeah, they're landlocked. But there's still a lot of sentiment for it today, and their government structure is different. There's different school systems just for Quebec in Canada. There are laws just on things needing to be in French language out there in Quebec. It's how serious they take it. Going on to another secessionist movement in North America, which isn't a very strong one, just by virtue of not a lot of people live there, and that's Greenland. Because Greenland is technically not its own sovereign nation. It's still part of the Kingdom of Denmark. One country that we left off the list for secessionist movements was the Faroe Islands, which is also part of Denmark itself. Denmark has a lot of overseas territories. Also the Virgin Islands used to be so. But Greenland has its own culture. They're not ethnically the same as Denmark. They're very separate, but there's not a lot of natives living in Greenland whatsoever either. So
Iceland is green, Greenland is ice.
Yeah. So there's not too much to be mad about, but they wouldn't mind being a nation.
Nope.
But going on to the last separatist group in the United States, and that is Zapatista.
You mean in North America?
In North America. I got confused there for a second. In North America, and that is in Chiapas, Mexico. It is a leftist revolutionary movement in Chiapas. So in the vein of like anarchist, Marxist of that sort, and they, as of 1994, they've declared war on the government of Mexico and the military itself. And, they have their own, because it's so remote out there. It's jungles, they're Mayans, they're very, ethnically different than the rest of Mexico to a good degree. They do have autonomous control out there. Revolutionaries fighting for, hammer and sickle.
I was going to say, if you look at pictures of them, they do look like your average leftist anarchist group. Antifa, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, the Antifa get a lot of inspiration from the Zapatistas.
They look very similar, yeah.
Because the Zapatistas, they've enacted revolutionary violence on numerous occasions. You just look at how unstable Mexico is. The Zapatistas have more to offer you than the government in a lot of instances. So I don't know. It's kind of like the Naxalites in India, which we talked about in the Global Conflicts Report. There are multiple movements of, communist groups that are just fighting the government in places. Going on now to Asia, we're going to get into some different groups there. So I first just wanted to mention the modern state of Myanmar, former Burma to begin with. I don't want to go over, every single state there, but It's an extremely diverse nation in terms of its ethnic composition, but the majority is the Barmar. They make up about 65% of the nation. And this is, just straight ethnic conflict. All these different peoples are fighting each other, and the government oppresses people out there and, fights these different ethnic groups. So you have, like, the Kashin group, or the Kashin nation out there, and the Mon nation, and they, get into alliances with one another, and they fight each other. And it's been like this since around 1989, so the fighting there is ceaseless. So I just want to mention there's a lot of secessionist movements out there, and it's mainly based on just ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
They have so many minority groups out there. It's crazy. Going on to the next Asian secessionist movement I want to talk about, and that is Northern Cyprus. So I believe it was in the 1970s, 1974, I believe it was, in the nation of Cyprus. There's different ethnicities that live there. There's the Cypriots, there's the Greeks, there's the Turks, and the Greeks revolted. They wanted to annex Cyprus away back to Greece because the Aegean Sea, they're right in the middle of it. The Greek diaspora is just spread all across that swath of, islands just out there. And people have a lot of, solidarity and connection to their ethnic kinship out there. But when the Greek uprising happened in 74, the Turks invaded Cyprus to protect the Turkish minority that was living in Cyprus. And they have permanently set up territory in northern Cyprus, this small island, and there's 2 separate nations on it.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, and there are, displaced Greeks that were living in northern Cyprus, which is now all Turkish now. And, the Turkish military keeps troops there. And they've tried to resolve this on many occasions, but, they just never gotten around to it. I forget the name of the city there, but there's a city there that is completely deserted because of the invasion.
Really?
Yeah, and it used to have like 100,000 people. Moving on to some stuff in China. The first secessionist movement I want to get into is modern-day Taiwan. So the situation with Taiwan is very complicated because, ethnically, it has been colonized throughout its history by, mainland China. It used to be called Formosa. But you go back to, I guess World War II is where this all takes the change. With Mao Zedong, there was all these different warlords around fighting the Japanese, and they were united fighting the Japanese. But once, the Japanese were defeated and World War II finished, they just fought each other. So the communists took power over most of China. And I guess you could say the capitalist forces, they all went to Taiwan, which, is why today China still claims Taiwan as part of its territory, why Taiwan isn't allowed to be a nation in the Olympics, because it will cause too much controversy. They have to call themselves Chinese Taipei. But Taiwan is a nation that pretty much exists purely because of the United States military force has a presence in Taiwan, and they're their own nation. I mean, It's a pretty developed nation for not even being fully recognized.
Yeah, I was going to say, Taipei 101 is one of the tallest buildings in Asia, and it's built there, so it's not like they don't have economic development.
Yeah, they're not Transnistria. But moving on to the next secessionist movement in China, I wanted to talk about Tibet.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Tibet, they are ethnically different than the majority of China, which is, Han. They make up kind of a diaspora across the Himalayas. And, especially in recent history, there's been the Free Tibet movement. There's been a lot of persecution of the Tibetan people. and there's been a lot of ethnic displacement of Tibetan people with Han Chinese majority moving in Tibet. So, the relations are very hot out there. The ethnic conflict is very strong, but Beijing is a very strong regime. And moving on to the last secessionist movement in China, it is Eastern or East Turkestan, or you could call it Ugistan. Well, I'm just collecting my thoughts for a second.
Yeah,
I've been talking quite incessantly, but the Uyghur people are part of a region in China called Xinjiang, and they are ethnically Turkish, and they are majority Muslim. So not only are they ethnicity-wise different than the majority of China, they are also religiously different. And they also have their own language.
I was going to say, isn't this area mostly the desert also?
It is predominantly like desert and mountains.
Whereas a lot of the rest of China is, more green and mountainous.
Yeah. More akin to stuff like agriculture.
Right.
Now, this is a region that historically has been more nomadic, more people grazing animals. Most of Central Asia's history is like that. But these are a separate people. They see themselves as a people, and they've been fighting for independence, and there's been terrorist attacks out there on the behalf of the Uyghurs trying to fight for independence, but the Chinese crack down on them extremely hard. They don't tolerate much stuff happening out there, which is why you don't hear much about it whatsoever, because the state media in China doesn't talk about what they do there.
Of course not.
But that's the thing going on. Moving on now to another secessionist movement we saw a vote on recently, and that is Kurdistan. Now, Kurdistan, the Kurdish people, are a diaspora of people across many different nations in the Middle East. You see them in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, all across the swath there.
Mostly in Iraq and Syria, though.
Mostly Iraq and Syria, but Turkey and Iran. Pretty big numbers of Kurdish people as well. But they don't have a nation. They're ethnically different than, most of the populations of the nations they are a part of. They have the history in Iraq with being oppressed by the Saddam regime. They're fighting for independence, and they had the referendum in northern Iraq, but the Baghdadi, government doesn't recognize the vote whatsoever, so tensions are pretty hot there. And also with Kurdistan, it plays into Rojava, which is another unrecognized nation that exists in northern Syria, which is a Kurdish majority, a Kurdish majority government. What they have out there in Rojava is kind of an anarchist state. Pretty much, you could say the only one that truly exists to the political doctrine of anarchism, I understand it as someone as, being libertarian socialism. They actually have their own system where, the only tax that exists out there is a land tax, I believe. And they use the oil that exists out there for public services. So just healthcare is free and stuff out there. It's very complex, and they've been fighting ISIS, for the last couple of years incessantly every day, on their borders. And now they're having to deal with the Turks coming in and destroying things. But yeah, the Kurdistan and the Kurdish people, a long history of conflict with the nations within they reside, and they're definitely people that want their own nation because they're very different. They're their own people. Moving on now to, I guess you could call this a secessionist movement. It's obviously not a country that's recognized by every nation, but that's Palestine. A lot of nations have recognized Palestine as a nation. it's not with Palestine any really central government within themselves, because the Gaza Strip is on its own, blockaded by the Israelis, surrounded by walls.
It's the most highly dense population density. It's like the highest place in the world.
Yeah, 2 million people live in the Gaza Strip, and it is, just one singular city. And like in Palestine, one of the interesting things is the median age of people. I believe median or average. The average age of a person in Palestine is 15 years old.
Wow.
So it's an extremely young society, one that could really, really express itself militarily if they had anything that they could even compete with the Israelis, which they don't. But I don't know, Palestine, yeah, there doesn't seem to be an end to this conflict anytime soon.
No, that conflict's going to go on for the rest of history.
We're talking about just last week or so, or the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about the protests there on the border with Palestine, where the Israeli officials have been firing live ammunition and killed over a dozen people. Really, really crazy stuff still happening out there. The next Asian secessionist movement I wanted to talk about, which we have talked about their exploits on Trump Republic Radio on the Sunday show before, is the Bangsamoro Republic, which is a breakaway nation in the Philippines, which is also one of these communist kind of anarchist groups, but they are also a Muslim minority that is in the Philippines. And, we talked a lot about the fighting that happened between, Duterte's military and the Moros a lot last year. Especially towards the beginning when we were doing the show back. I guess the fighting was going on in May.
May and stuff, yeah.
But, they declared their capital as Davao City, which is actually the city that Rodrigo Duterte used to be the mayor of. So, the fighting's kind of always going on there. It's a active insurgency in terms of a secessionist movement. Moving on to the last Asian secessionist movement that I wanted to talk about, which is not, anywhere nearly as hostile as the Bangsamoro Republic, secessionist movement, is Tuva, which is in Russia. It also goes by the name Tana Tuva, but they are the Tuvans. They are a Mongolian people. They have their own, autonomous nation. I believe there's about... Not a lot of people live there.
This shows as of 2010, it's estimated about 300,000.
300,000, yeah. I was going to say, not a lot of people live there, but they are ethnic Mongolians that, rule over themselves for the most part out there. But they're part of Russia. And it kind of plays into another, I guess you could say this is another secessionist movement in China, but also China has a region called Inner Mongolia, where the majority is Mongolian. The Mongolian people is not just Mongolia. It spreads across these nations. They've, in the past in Tuva, they've had moves towards Mongolian unification. They've had moves towards their own statehood. I know during the Russian Revolution, they even declared their own independent Soviet. These, small number of Mongolians that live in Russia. But, there's just, Russia's so ethnically diverse.
Yeah.
Moving on to the last secessionist movements, we only got a couple, and I know we've been going on for a while, so it's good to close this up soon. But we're going to go on to some in Africa. So the first secessionist movement I want to talk about is the Republic of Lagone, which is a secessionist movement and, essentially its own state in the Central African Republic, which the Republic of Lagone, also known as the Republic of Dar el Kuti, is a Muslim rebellion that happened in, the Central African Republic is predominantly Christian, but it is a Muslim secessionist movement Their movement is called Seleka, and they've only had independence as of, well, their own declared independence, that is, since December 14th of 2015.
Jeez.
So this is a
very recent,
very recent breakaway state. There's still ongoing fighting as it is, but there's not much out there. Moving on now to Western Sahara. Western Sahara is an unusual situation because it is controlled by Morocco, but they see themselves as a separate people. They are essentially like a subject nation, like a colony of Morocco. Western Sahara is populated ethnically by Arabic people, which is not the ethnic composition of Morocco. So they, are being ruled by a foreign people. And it's kind of just one of those holdovers from colonialism, because it was the reins of Western Sahara was handed over to Morocco. But these people are just kind of, I don't know, won independence, but it's hard to break away. They are very, very authoritarian in how they deal with it.
I was going to say, Western Sahara, that disputed boundary there with Morocco, I've seen that as a disputed boundary on maps even when I was a child.
Yeah.
On, globes, I'm saying. So, it's very, very, famously disputed. But, before you go on to the next one, I think there was one thing that I wanted to mention about a secessionist movement that was successful recently.
Yes.
And that was South Sudan.
Yeah,
broke
that
off
was one.
From Sudan. And this happened, it declared its independence in 2011. So it's technically it's the newest country in the world. But, it's recognized by everything, and their economy sucks, and there's not that many people that live there, and there's really nothing there at all. But it's got 600,000 people. Or, I'm sorry, 12 million people that live there. So, when people can gather together and actually get support, secessionist movements can be successful, and the global scene, does actually look at these sort of things.
Yeah.
So, boundaries constantly change. There's no reason for them to stay the same.
Yeah. One of the things of note about Western Sahara is it's one of those sparsely populated areas in the world.
Yeah, not many people live there, do
There's
they?
only 500,000 people that live there. So when we were talking about the potential of Wyoming breaking away from the United States, it's the same amount of people pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much.
The next secessionist movement that we want to talk about is Somaliland. So Somalia is, for the most part, a failed state, broken into different tribal or kind of warlord regions, and also ISIS pretty much. But in western Somalia, though, there is Somaliland, which broke away back in the 90s. It was broke away from Somalia and has created its own government. And they have a functioning government out there that collects taxes, that offers services, that offers policing. Is the only part of Somalia that isn't desolate third world. It's not a great place to live. You won't see me going there, but it is a functioning state, and it is an unrecognized state. And now going to the last two things that we wanted to talk about, which is something that we kind of have good knowledge on just by who we know, and that is South African secessionist movements.
Yeah.
And the first one we wanted to talk about is Volksstaat, or the idea of a Boer republic. So, you can go listen to any of our interviews with Simon Roche or Karen Smith. She did an extremely good job on describing, the history of the Boer people out there, because you need to understand the history very well to understand these people. The Boer people are a white population of, formerly Dutch people. They kind of have a language similar to Dutch that are native to the region, I could say. I mean, they've been there since the 1700s. They've been there for hundreds of years. They have been in regions of South Africa longer than any black person has. I'm not saying that they're the only people there, but they are more rooted to their areas to which they, developed than a lot of people that have come to South Africa over the years that, just are black Africans, like most Africans in Africa. So, we've talked about the issues of squatter camps and white rights in South Africa and the kind of disenfranchisement that the Boer people have. And, the government doesn't care about them whatsoever. They're on the verge of genociding them pretty much out there. They obviously want their own independence, and they have had their independence in the past, in Orange and Transvaal. But it was the British who, came in and took over their countries because there was gold there, and annexed them into South Africa proper. Because, South Africa, as we know it, is a British conception, but the Boers aren't British people.
No.
And moving on to the last kind of secessionist movement, which plays into a secessionist movement that tried to petition for secession very recently in South Africa, and that is Western Cape. This is something that is being led by the Khoisan people, which are not African in the sense of like black Africans, but they are the natives to the area. If there are anyone that you could say that is native to South Africa, is the Khoisan people, but they're predominantly nomadic people that have, they're kind of like smaller than the average African. They don't look the same. And they also, so the Khoisan have been trying to gain independence for Western Cape, and within Western Cape, they want to create different ethnic divisions for the different peoples that live out there. Because not only are there, your black Africans, your white Afrikaners, your white people of British or Portuguese origin, you also have the colored people, which there is a historical mixed race people that have existed in South Africa for nearly just as long, that also, aren't part of the majority in Africa. So they have pushed for recently independence to try and protect all these different minority groups, but the South African government hasn't recognized it whatsoever, and they haven't been able to get much success with it.
Yeah, I was looking here at the at just the breakdown demographically of Western Cape. The colored people make up 49%.
Yeah,
almost half. And the Africans are only...
And we're not trying to sound like we're racist. This is the name of the group there.
Yeah, it's called the colored people. The Africans there, they're only about 33% of Western Cape. And white people there are 16%.
Yeah.
And what's the white population of South Africa overall? Like 2%?
2%.
So you can see where, like, it's very concentrated in that area.
In that area, yeah.
For, whites that do live in South Africa. Or South African whites, I should say.
So, yeah, very precarious situation, and things are getting bad in South Africa. We have talked probably more than anyone on what's going on out there in the world right now, bar maybe Lauren Southern at this point. So, this has been our show on secessionist movements. We talked a lot about a tons of different secessionist movements, our thoughts on secessionist movements.
And we left out so many.
So many. But it really goes to show you that presently, there are tons of places that are currently involved in secession. There are people all across the world trying to, engage in secession with varying different degrees of success. Sometimes people secede and, they have a kind of poor place like Abkhazia,
or South Sudan.
No one lives there. But sometimes there is success from secessionist movements, such as, I would say, Rojava's success, just in that they're not being oppressed by, Turks. So, any final thoughts, Bobby, on secessionist movements before we close out this episode?
The only thing I would have to say to close out this episode is borders have constantly changed for millennia. And as much as we like to see borders stay the same as they are for purposes of looking at maps or whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean that people are happy within those borders. And borders can change, and in some cases probably should, in some cases probably not, just because of the fact that it might be better off for the people that live there or not. But at the same time, countries should be protecting their borders, and if a group wants to break off, try to do it as peacefully as you can rather than violently. And unfortunately, almost all of these movements that we've talked about have had violence involved in them.
Yes.
So, anyways, that's all I have to say other than what I've already said about this.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, sorry, hope you enjoyed the episode, and we're going to have our regular Sunday up, same time as always.
Yes.
So.
Glad we were able to do our first midweek in 3 months.
And we'll try to keep on it with the midweeks. We'll try to come up with something interesting for next week.
Yep.
But, again, thank you for listening, and have a good one.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.